Hi, this is Ilon Huang with a special English edition of Rund um die Insel. I believe the following interview, respectively the story behind it, is so interesting that I wanted to share the original English version. Some of you might have heard the so-called Little People myth, which is told by Taiwan's indigenous Saixa people. Is this just a legend without any historical base, or might there be more to the story? Someone who has been fascinated by the story and has done a lot of research about it is Toby Openshaw, filmmaker from South Africa. And now Toby has just published a book called Seeking the Koko Da'ai, investigating the origins of Little People myth in Taiwan and beyond. I wanted to learn more about the story, Toby's research, and this book. So I met up with him, and my first question was what Koko Da'ai means. How does it relate to this Little People myth?
Right. So the Koko Da'ai, or just the Da'ai, come from a myth that the Saixa people in Taiwan, the indigenous group of Taiwan, tells, which says that they met little people, short little people, who were very mischievous and liked to play tricks, and they called them the Da'ai. Mm-hmm. And every 2 years there is a ritual called the Bas Da'ai, which the Saixa people have. And so, yes, they are related.
I think you had the chance to see this ceremony, this Bas Da'ai. Can you explain the ceremony, and are there still many people doing it?
Okay, so I came to Taiwan 26 years ago. I'm a documentary filmmaker from South Africa. And when I was living in South Africa and Namibia, I had some experience working on documentaries about South Africa and Namibia's indigenous people. But then I came to Taiwan, and for a long time, there's a lot of Taiwan culture that's really, really interesting. So I was mostly focused on those kind of things. But about 13 years ago, a friend of mine invited me up to an indigenous village. And so that was my first real interaction with Taiwan's indigenous people. And I very soon discovered that these people have been through the same issues and struggles that indigenous people pretty much around the world have had, So they're the first inhabitants of the land. They, have their wars and whatever amongst each other. But then at some point, a colonial force comes in, forces their language and their way of life onto these people, which usually then means that their language, their culture, and everything dies out or gets close to dying out. But then in most places, people start to recover their language and their culture and their identity as indigenous people. And so that was just the start of that process that I started to see in Taiwan around that time. But this invitation was to a specific event, which is called the Bas Da'ai. And so I went there. It's a ritual that I was told these people do every 2 years. And it's centered around a really, really interesting story. So the story is, many, many years ago, the Saixa people came up to the mountains from the plains where they were living before. And it was difficult for them to make a living there. They didn't know how things worked in the mountains. But they found a group of short, little people with dark skin and curly hair, according to most of the talks. And these little people showed them how to grow millet in the mountains and how to hunt the wild boar and things like that, and help them to get by. And so they had a good relationship with these people, whom they called the Da'ai. However, the Da'ai were basically dying out. They were on very low numbers. And they also were known for being very mischievous and liked to play tricks on people, and they could do magic tricks according to the myth and everything. And unfortunately, this also included them harassing the Saishat women. And so that then basically made a rift between the Saishat and the Da'ai. And it got so bad that one night, one of the Saishat young men decided to go down to the river, because the Da'ai used to live across the river from them. And there was a tree that they used sort of like a bridge across the river. So he partially cut through that tree. And his idea was that night after the feast, once the Da'ai had all left, he was going to cut through the rest of the tree, make it crash down, and then tell them, don't come back. We don't want you here anymore, you've become too troublesome. Unfortunately, as so often happened, on that night, everybody got drunk and the fights broke out, and eventually all the Da'ai in one go decided to leave, and they all trooped down to the river and all got onto this tree at the same time, and the tree broke and crashed into the river down below, killing all of them. Except for one, the shaman, who had made it across to the other side. And when he saw what had happened, he called down a curse on the Saisha people. And sure enough, terrible things happened. Earthquakes, typhoons, babies born with two heads, the classic story about curses, right? So this young man felt really bad about what had happened. It wasn't really his intention. And so he wanted to think of some way to make it up to them. And the Da'ai used to sing a song that went on and on. It had many verses and then repeated some parts and went on again and repeated some parts like that. And so he actually taught himself the whole song of the Da'ai. And a year later, he met with the shaman again. And he said, look, I want to say I'm sorry. I want to apologize for what happened. And to show you my contrition, I have learned your song. And he performed the whole thing for the shaman, which takes days, And the shaman said, okay, I accept your apology, thank you, but you have to go back to your people. And every year, you have to bring the whole tribe together, and you have to perform this song, and you have to perform this ritual. Then I will keep the curse away from you. And so they did. And so for hundreds of years, the Saisha people every year performed what they call the Basta'ai. During the time of the Japanese occupation in Taiwan, the Japanese tried to put a stop to this because they were Japanifying everybody. They wanted to teach the indigenous people, modern ways and the Japanese language, and everybody had to have a Japanese name and so on. But a Japanese official went up to the mountain with a translator and wrote down for the first time, this was 1906, for the first time wrote down the story as I just told it to you now. And he came back down and he told his superiors, don't stop this thing. These people believe really bad things will happen to them if you stop it. And to their credit, the Japanese agreed. And they did, however, negotiate with the Saisha, and they agreed to just do it every 2 years. Oh. And so since that time then, it's every 2 years. And so I have now been to every Basta'ai since 2012. So this year will be my 6th. And now, being curious, one of my first questions was, where did this story come from? Where did this idea of little people? Because then I also started to realize that there are very similar stories in other places around the world. In Western countries, we have, goblins and dwarves and things like that. But in the Pacific, we also have little people who are mischievous and magical. In Hawaii, they talk about the menehune. And they even say there are still some buildings that were, or structures that were built by the menehune. And in the Solomon Islands, they talk about the kakamora. And in the movie Moana, we find there are these little men that are made of coconuts, and they're actually a reference to the kokomora. And so the kokomora are said to be little people that used coconuts as helmets and armor on their bodies. So Disney just took that idea and made little coconut men. But actually, the research that went into Moana is really not bad. It's actually, Disney has really been doing good on that kind of stuff these days. Okay. Anyway, so I started just asking around, like, what could possibly be the origin of this myth? Were there ever short little people in Taiwan? And everybody I talked to, the anthropologists, the archaeologists, all just say, well, we have no evidence, no such thing. Right. But I was really persistent on this. And so for the next, 10 years, whenever I had an opportunity to talk to people who are into DNA studies, people who are into ethno-linguistics, all of those fields, talked about this. And they all agreed that it was an interesting question, but that we don't have evidence. Then, one of the things that also popped out at me was in 2007 or so, there was a discovery on the island of Flores in Indonesia of a really short human, like only like two and a half feet tall. And so Homo floresiensis. And so, that again set my thoughts going, like, what if there were people like that here who are humanoid, not really fully human, but the timeline doesn't match because Homo floresiensis is 50,000 years old. We know that in Taiwan, the indigenous people who are today's Austronesians came here about 6,000 years ago only. And, it's important to understand that in Taiwan, there were what we call pre-Austronesians, people who came here and who lived here. They were basically in the Paleolithic age, and they left stone tools and shell mounds of all the shells.
Actually, my son is just learning about it in middle school.
There you go. So there's a shell midden here at Yenshan by the MRT station. There's a big shell midden there. And you can literally walk through the path there and pick little pieces of shell out of the ground there.
Okay.
But anyway, so the pre-Austronesians left those things behind, but then they disappeared. They passed. And then what we now call the Proto-Austronesians came over from what is today the mainland of China. But they spoke a language which is called PAN, it's Proto-Austronesian, which has disappeared. But we see its roots in the languages that the indigenous people, the 16 recognized tribes in Taiwan today speak,
And that's totally different from like what we call Mandarin and Taiwanese.
Absolutely. It's not a Sinitic language at all. And so we also know that the pre-Austronesians came here, and then after 1,000 years or so, they started migrating, and they conquered the entire Pacific Ocean and colonized, or settled, we should say, places like Hawaii, Fiji, Samoa, Solomon Islands, all the way to New Zealand, the Maori people, right? So
that's why we also have a lot of exchanges in the past years.
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
New
I
Zealand.
myself have
And
brought
you-
Maori people here
Right, you're
for
involved
cultural
in this.
exchange. Yeah. So, and it's amazing. I have taken Moana, who is a well-known Maori singer in New Zealand. I've taken her up the mountains here, and we're going to introduce her to some of the indigenous people there. And there's an uncle standing there cooking by his food cart, And I say to him, ta Moana tasha Maori ren. She's Maori. And he go, woman young, we are the same. And they talking, and she can't speak any Mandarin, he can't speak any English, but there's a connection, It's really amazing to see that, Well, anyway, so that kind of topic then stayed with me for a long time, and I did a lot of reading up about it and research and everything. And then about 3 years ago now, a skeleton that has been sitting in storage at the NTU Museum for 30 years already was reconstructed and analyzed. And the paper, which was a whole paper about the process of several other skulls, reconstruction, blah, blah, blah. The paper had one little paragraph that said, this skull, which was found in Taiwan, seems to be Negrito. And this would lead one to think that that might be the origin of some of the myths. So now we need to talk a little bit about Negrito. So in the Philippines.
Actually, this skeleton, because I read about this case, but the skeleton was not just newly found like 3 years ago.
It had been sitting in storage for a long time.
Yeah.
But because Professor Hong, who was one of the leaders of that project, they were looking for skulls to measure as part of a craniometric study that they were doing. It's a huge database they were building. And they realized that amongst their database, they have very few female skulls. So they put out a request among museums around the region, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on, for female skulls over a certain age. Yeah. And so this one was offered to them, So it was almost by accident.
Okay.
No, it was pretty much by accident, I would say. And so, like I say, she just wrote this one little paragraph, and my good friend Michael Turton, who's also interested in this topic, flagged it for me, and he said, hey, did you see this? And I'm like, no, and oh my gosh, because Negritos are short-statured, dark-skinned, curly-haired people who are not African, but there are some populations remaining in the Philippines.
Yeah.
And so looking at Negrito migrations, I see that in the early or the late Ice Age, around, let's say, 17 to 15,000 years ago, the whole area down south from where we are, Borneo, Sulawesi, parts of the Philippines, and so on, was one landmass. And that was called Sunda land, right? Because all the water was up in the ice, and so the sea levels were much lower. And so it is literally possible for those people to have walked to Taiwan overland, And if you look at the patterns of the migration, so out of Africa, 100,000 to 80,000 years ago, into Australia, very early. Australian people say they've been there 80,000 years. And then down into Sundaland. And then back up from Sundaland, more north, possibly as the sea level started rising again. And crossing Taiwan or into Taiwan, and some remaining behind in the Philippines. Yeah. So this skeleton that was found in Taiwan is 5,500 years old. So that's just at a time when there could have been overlap between the pre-Austronesians and the Proto-Austronesians.
Okay.
So, I always have to tell people very clearly, this is not evidence done and dusted. We're all good now. Now we know exactly what happened.
Yeah.
It's not like that. This is one little data point, but the point is before we had none.
Yeah.
So that was super exciting to me. So I contacted Professor Hong right away. She's Taiwanese, but she's based in Australia. And so then she wrote a full article about the skull and about its implications, But I immediately realized that this is a topic I've been sitting on for 13 years, and that's, really been taken up a lot of my time and my interest, and I've made so many connections with so many people just talking about this topic, and I feel that we need to put a book together.
Okay.
And basically...
Also, actually, that was like 3 years ago that you started say, okay.
Yes.
But you had a lot of ideas or thoughts about this before.
Absolutely.
But that was the point where you said, okay, we have to collect.
Let's do this book.
Yeah.
Let's put our stake in the ground for the current state of knowledge on this topic, And so 3 years ago, I started reaching out to all the people that I know whose articles I have read, who have ever written anything on these topics. And when I say these topics, it's pretty broad. I'm very much a multidisciplinary researcher, and this is very much a multidisciplinary book. And I love that. I like that way, where it gives you a broad overview from many different perspectives.
Okay.
So I invited these authors, and I have to say most of the people that I reached out to were immediately excited about the idea and agreed to write chapters.
Can you summarize a little bit who these people are?
Yeah. So Professor Paul Lee is one of the sort of foremost researchers in Taiwan. And so he wrote a chapter about Neolithic populations in Taiwan as a possible inspiration for this mythical little people, right? And then Professor Hong wrote the next chapter, which is tracing Negritos and their paths in Taiwan, because this is then based on her discovery. So she wrote a brand new chapter for us, which was wonderful. Roger Blench is a ethnolinguist, and 2 years ago I went to London and spoke about this book at SOAS, at the School for Oriental and African Studies, in their summer school. And Professor Blench came down from Cambridge and listened to my talk and was excited and gave some feedback and actually invited me up to Cambridge. And so he actually wrote 2 chapters about the language that we find today and how that might trace back to a pre-Austronesian path. Because today's Austronesian languages are considered to be just that. And we know with high level of certainty that the pre-Austronesians did not speak that language. We don't know what they spoke. But so he's saying there are a few words here and there in the today's Austronesian languages that doesn't really fit, and that could possibly refer back to an earlier language contact between people, Then Bjorn Griffin wrote a chapter about Negritos in the Philippines, and he actually lives in the Philippines, and he has very close connection there. Professor Leo, another one, a chapter about the Kokota'ai amongst the Saishat people. And then a very interesting chapter is Dean Karalekas, who is my co-editor on the book. he wrote a chapter about the primordial little people type. And so basically tracing Pacific dwarf myths throughout the Austronesian expansion. So he looks at the Menehune and the Kokomora and so on, and especially looking at the similarities between those stories, because they're all 3 feet tall, dark skin, curly hair, naughty, magical, likes to live in caves. You know, the stories have a great amount of similarity across. And so that's a really interesting topic just to look at and to look at it. And
so for an amateur, that might be a proof that these peoples are related.
So it's not proof. We know it's in anthropology, we very seldom use the word proof, right? Because we can't make a mathematical proof. We can say that it is a strong indication that what we think it is that the myth traveled.
Yeah.
So the story originated in Taiwan, but it traveled with people as they went across the ocean. And because we know a lot of things that traveled across the ocean with those people. So many words, right? Language. So things like, you know, I've been in at the conference where there's somebody from the Philippines and somebody from Hawaii and somebody from Indonesia and 1 or 2 Taiwan indigenous people. And then I say, okay, everybody say 5. And they all say lima or rima. And I say, okay, and they all say mata. And you say fish, and they say ikan. You know, so there's those words, we call them canoe words. They've traveled across the ocean. And then, of course, the big thing that has proven to us, this expansion started from Taiwan, or has come close to proving for us, is the bark from the mulberry tree, the paper mulberry tree. They use the bark from that tree to make cloth, so bark cloth. And so those trees in Hawaii, you can do a DNA test and trace them back to Taiwan. Their seeds came from Taiwan. And tapa beaters, they use a stone tool to beat the cloth with. They're same design, and they can be found in archaeological digs from here right across the Pacific. You know, so really interesting stuff. Then Gregory IV wrote a chapter for us because he's one of the people who actually wrote the first articles about the little people of Flores. So it's really great to have a chapter from him. Yeah, and so on. So it's an academic book, but it's pretty easy reading. And it's just fascinating stuff, and it's got all these bits and pieces in it that it puts together like a puzzle, you know. And then very important I need to mention is that because this is a story that relates to Taiwan's indigenous people, it was very, very important for us to make sure that we honor the fact that this story belongs to the Saishat people, right? So I now told you the story in, you know, what sounded like my words, but trust me, these are pretty much how the elder I've had the story told me by many elders, but the particular one that we recorded and that we use as a base. So this is the way they tell the story, you know. So I'm making very clear it's not my story. This is somebody else's story. So I really wanted to have indigenous researchers to write chapters for the book. Unfortunately, because of Taiwan's, you know, colonial past and the fact that there are very few researchers who are indigenous who are researching in this field even, that was really tough. And in fact, the one Saishat elder who I invited to write was already very old, and he actually passed away before he could do that. So what I then decided to do or attempted is, you know, there is actually a pretty active indigenous fiction writing community in Taiwan.
Oh, really?
Yeah. A few years ago, several years ago now, there was at the Taipei Book Festival, there was a whole section of indigenous writers. And so when I've got copies of those books which are anthologies of indigenous writing and so on. I thought, wow, this is amazing stuff. And the person who really pulls that stuff together is called CJ, is her name, CJ Anderson Wu, and she has edited several volumes of indigenous writing and so on. So she's really known for her work on promoting indigenous fiction. And so I contacted with her, and I was like, you know, can we invite some indigenous writers to write short fiction pieces that we can include in the book, you know? And so she did that, and again, we got 4 really nice, cool stories on this theme of little people, but fiction. Yeah. One of them is almost a science fiction piece, you know. Yeah. And so what we did is we put those pieces in between sections of the book, you know. So the book is sort of divided with mythology and science and so on, but we use those as chapter breaks. We were a little concerned because this is, I said, an academic book, and you don't normally include fiction in an academic book. But I was very fortunate that the reviewer who reviewed our book for the publisher, she really got it. She understood what this was about, and she wrote actually a really, really, really good review, for which we are very thankful, you know. And so, so we got Brill, the academic publisher, which is a publisher based in the Netherlands. They have a series in Taiwan Studies, or they started a series in Taiwan Studies book, which at that point was 1. And so then they accepted this as book 2 in that series. So we are very, very thankful, you know, to Brill for, they gave us a color cover, my photos on the cover. They gave us actually a few more pages than we expected, more illustrations and photos than we expected. And so, you know, here I sit now today with this book that's been, you know, in the back of my head for 12 years and in production for 3 years. And I'm just super, super happy to see it, you know, and it looks great. The photo qualities looks pretty good. And it's our positioning document that says this is what we know today about little people in Taiwan and the Pacific.
Is this the end of this project for you, or do you think now you're just getting started, like really getting started to find strong indications, not proof?
So, you know, I'm definitely taking a bit of a break. Although I am doing a short documentary film about this topic for, I should probably not say right now for who yet, but we did get a broadcaster, and that will then be like a companion piece to the book. The Basta Ai, the original festival, is in November this year. So we will be going there with our cameras and everything, and we will be filming and talking to the elders and having them explain to us the ritual and all of that. We will be interviewing Professor Hong, and, you know, so we'll make a little mini documentary or a shortish documentary about it. But yes, since I have put the book to bed, a lot of other research and topics and things have come up that I never had access to before, you know. I should say it directly. My girlfriend started getting really interested in this topic. And so because she reads Mandarin, she's finding all this papers and information and stuff that comes out. Now, nothing that has come out so far has rendered what we've done here not good. You know, it's all good. We're absolutely on the right path. But there is more and wider information available. So I'm thinking maybe there will be volume 2, you know.
Good luck for that. Couple questions to the Basta Ai. Where is that in Taiwan?
So in the mountains of Hsinchu, in an area called Ufeng, there is the ritual grounds are there. And so every 2 years they have the Basta Ai. It's in a village called Da'ai.
And is this public or like?
So it is technically open to the public, but it's really important for people to understand this is not like a harvest festival. This is not a come and have a party and we'll put on a show for you, our visitors. This is not a show for visitors. This is
not
a ritual.
To see the indigenous people being cute.
No, absolutely not. So this is a ritual that they do for themselves. And yes, on part of it, the 3-day part of it over a weekend is open to the public. But people are requested to be like really, really respectful and so on if they do wish to attend.
Okay. Maybe before we get to the end, do you have any plans for book talks or something like that?
Yeah, so I have in fact already at Taipei American School given a class about the book, because there are students here who do what they call AP research. And so I talk to them about the process of getting a topic, becoming interested in it, doing the research, you know, living the topic. I told them all, you have to work for 10 years like I did on your topic, you know, and then, you know, putting it together. So that was very, very well received. And I will do a launch event a smallish launch event here at Taipei American School, which is where I work. It's my day job. But I will also have a proper launch event once I receive the author's copies from the publisher, because each author in the book will get one copy. And once I get those, then we will have a launch event. We'll invite all the writers to come, all the ones who are in Taiwan, to be here. And we'll have a press event and hand out the books and so on. I wish I could tell everybody to please buy a copy of the book. Unfortunately, it is academic pricing, so it's super expensive. It's like 146 euro. But that not to say that you shouldn't. If anybody's interested enough, thank you very much. It is definitely intended for libraries, academic libraries and so on, But, all of that said, I've already sold 10 copies to friends and relations, so I guess,
Good. Perhaps ebook?
Yeah, so it is available as a PDF. Unfortunately, again, today's publishing, it's the same price.
Okay. That was Toby Openshaw, with whom I talked about his new book, Seeking the Koko Da'ai, investigating the origins of Little People myth in Taiwan and beyond. The German version of our interview will come out soon. Thanks for listening.